Aloha and welcome everyone to the Fit2Fat2Fit Experience podcast. I'm your host, Drew Manning, and I appreciate you guys tuning in today. So today's guest is Austin Mao. Austin Mao is a serial entrepreneur, author, poet, community builder, and a keynote speaker, renowned for his expertise at the intersection of science and spirituality, psychology, and shamanism. So he's a shaman. He runs a retreat center out in Colorado called Ceremonia, and they do psilocybin and ayahuasca retreats out there. But in this episode, we kind of dive into his story before he got into spirituality and being raised by a single mom and his experience with that and how that shaped him into the man he is today and how he leads and guides these spiritual retreats for people. I've never done anything like this other than Rhythmia down in Costa Rica, which I've shared with you guys on my podcast before. And it was a remarkable personal experience for me. And I asked him a lot of deep questions about psychedelics in general, the way they set up their retreat center and how they hold space for people and help people heal. It's a really powerful episode. If you're interested and curious to learn more about how it works, you can go check them out at ceremonia.com, Ceremonia. And if you're wondering, it is legal in Colorado. So it's not illegal. They offer legal psilocybin ayahuasca retreats aimed at profound personal transformation. Um, and this is one of the things that I do differently in the health and fitness industry is I talk about different modalities that help people heal. Because in my experience, when people are healed mentally, emotionally, spiritually, it makes their physical journey so much easier. The physical stuff like diet and exercise, the stuff we know we're supposed to do, tends to be easier for people who are doing the inner work. And psychedelics is just one modality among many other modalities that can help people heal on a mental, emotional, spiritual level. From what I've seen, it doesn't mean it's for everyone. So definitely do your research and take everything with a grain of salt. I definitely recommend that. But Austin's a great guy, and I really love his story and what he brings to the table, and how he helps people. So, really excited for this episode. Before we jump in, this episode is brought to you by Paluva. Paluva is a new zero drop minimalist shoe that has a unique design. It was designed by Mark Sisson, who's like the grandfather of the paleo movement and has written a bunch of books actually on barefoot running. And this is his new venture. After selling Primal Kitchen, he created a shoe company called Peluva, Peluva, and they have a unique 5-toe design. So each toe has its own slot. But I recently started using this shoe for rucking and absolutely love it. It's a game changer. It feels very natural. It feels great on my feet. I actually ruck and walk, but I also do ruck shuffling, which is like a slow jog with the rucksack on my back. And I put these shoes to the test multiple times, and it's my new favorite shoe for rucking specifically because it feels great on my feet. And I know and trust Mark on a personal level, and I know he knows what he's talking about. And I'm a huge, huge fan of these new Peluva shoes. So if you're interested in trying these out, you can go to peluva.com, Peluva.com. Use the code DREW, DREW, at checkout, and you'll get 15% off your order. Give it a try. You can wear them inside the house. You can walk in them, run in them, ruck in them, whatever you want to do. Check them out, put them to the test, and let me know what you think about it. But I'm really excited to have them as a sponsor. So go show them some love. Peluva.com. Use the code DREW for 15% off. And with that being said, let's go hang out with Austin Mao. All right, Austin, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Feeling excited to be here. Thanks, Drew.
Yeah. Yeah, it's my pleasure to have you on. Really excited to dive into your journey and your story. The first question I tend to ask my guests that, it helps me understand you a little bit better and helps my audience understand you a little bit better is, I like to know what type of environment you grew up in, or maybe even your perception of the environment you grew up in that kind of led you down the path of who you are today. If you don't mind connecting the dots for us, maybe let's start there.
Yeah. So I grew up a single child to a single mom. My parents divorced when I was around 1 years old.
Mm.
And one of my core memories as a kid, um, first one is I think I was around 3 or 4 years old. My mom was standing outside the screen door, and I'm crying, and she's crying. And Of course, it's raining in the
Mm.
back. I don't know if it actually was or not, but in my
Yeah.
memory, it is. And
Yeah.
she's handing me off to my father, for me to be with my father for a
Mm.
while. And just remembering like the confusion and the extraordinary sense of abandonment that I felt.
Yeah.
Another core memory was singing to my mom as she was broken down on the floor crying.
Mm.
And at that time, I didn't know why she was in so much pain, but I just knew that my mom was hurting and I had to save her.
Mm.
And from that place, this savior complex was born in me to
Interesting.
need to save the feminine in my life.
Mm.
And when that was in the shadows for me, that would um, create some harm in my life. Right? I didn't know how to respect my own needs and boundaries,
Mm.
and was constantly taking responsibility for things that I didn't need to. So, but as I've brought that into the light, and the same energy that I put forward into trying to save people has now, I'd like to think, is now transmuted into a path of service.
Yeah. That's beautiful. And it's interesting how everything comes at a cost. So even like that savior complex you mentioned, like wanting to help people, want to save people, there's a shadow side to everything, right? Like it comes at a cost of maybe abandoning your own needs and wants and desires to give to others, and almost like people pleasing. I kind of grew up in a very similar way. I was one of 11 kids though, not well, not an only child,
Wow.
but I can only imagine what that must have been like. So, where did your journey take you into like? So, did you grow up mostly with your mom, and was your dad around, or how did that work?
I grew up mostly with my mom.
Okay.
Um, I would see my father as a kid once a week, once every few weeks, and then sometime sometime when I was around 10, my mother sued him for child support.
Mm,
And after that experience, he started seeing me less and less and less.
mm,
My father, I always had the perspective that he valued money more than me, right?
interesting.
And in many respects, money was his expressing love. When
Mm,
I've
got it.
revisited my father's side lineage and my own psychedelic experiences, I would see him growing up, stealing for food as a kid. Um,
Interesting.
he grew up a farmer's son, in Taiwan, and so there's this ancestral trauma, I guess you could say, that
Hmm.
was handed down to me, and that the way that the masculine in that line has expressed their connection is through something material. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I can definitely see that. Where did you grow up, and where did you go to school? Were you raised here in the United States, or were you abroad,
hmm I was born
internationally?
and raised in a suburb of Los Angeles, um,
Okay,
and lived there until my college years. And then
got it.
after that, I went to school in San Diego, studied abroad in Paris,
Nice.
and then after that, just became an entrepreneur multiple times over.
Yeah.
Um, so
Yeah.
I think many of us, we have this interplay between our masculine and our feminine sides coming from the templates of our parents, right? So I made uh, a very successful career as an entrepreneur, um, making money, right?
Hmm.
And ultimately became a tech founder and having the largest Airbnb operation in Las Vegas. Completely different than the nonprofit spiritual work that I do now.
Yeah,
um,
I have so many questions about that, but keep going. Sorry.
and then a few years ago, I had a transformative ayahuasca experience, where um, I heralded the renaissance of my life and started devoting more of my life and my energy and my resources towards plant medicine and towards spirituality and psychotherapy, etc. So that's kind of like the summary, the cliff notes of my
Yeah.
life.
I'm sure there's so much more to it. And before we get to that point in your story, I'm very curious to know because you mentioned before that your mom is conservative Christian, and is that the environment that you grew up in with that type of belief system?
No, my mom was, Christian. She
Hmm.
went to church occasionally. Um, it was really when I was 13 that she was in a horrific car accident, and she was, um, her heart literally stopped for
Hmm.
about a minute.
Wow.
and she was given a 10% chance of living. And
Oof.
so my mom last year came to a retreat and of our own, and we were talking about this experience because she had the experience of God, like a felt sense experience of extraordinary peace and acceptance and love when she died. Um,
Mm.
and it was
Wow.
after that experience that NDE, that near death experience, that she became more devoted to her faith.
Yeah.
And for me personally, like I think many Westerners can vibe with this. That church for me was boring and guilt driven, and I didn't want to go to church. And I've been a rebel and a defiant all my life, and so I would find every excuse to not go. And
Yeah.
before I started doing plant medicine, I was agnostic, bordering atheist. So um, I always have a little laugh that somehow I'm a minister now.
Yeah, in a certain way you are. I can see that. It's interesting how, I mean, just going to your mom's experience, like those experiences are so powerful for people. And when people tell me that they have those experiences, I believe them. But it happens to people in all different faiths. Like I mentioned to you, I grew
Uh-huh.
up in a very strict religion, and I had experiences in that faith that kind of confirmed my beliefs. And I'm like, yes, this is true for me. And, I've come to realize that a lot of people have their own versions of truth because of experiences that have shaped their beliefs, like, and that sometimes it's undeniable for them. Like, I had this experience, I can't deny it, it shapes my belief of this belief system, and that's what works for me. And I've learned to respect that instead of trying to condemn or convert other people to what I think is true because it's worked for me. I kind of have to let go of that control of like trying to convert people of like, hey, you need to like come over here, this is the right side, this is the right team. But it's very interesting. So with you growing up like that and your mom having that experience, did she try and get you to come and like try it? Was there any pressure there, or did she let you kind of do your own thing?
My mom has always been my number one supporter, and
Mm,
I am the man that I am today because of the tremendous amount of love that my mom has given me.
okay.
I remember I almost didn't graduate senior year of high school because of all the days that I skipped class
Hmm.
because she would write me a sick note so I could stay home and play video games.
Wow,
And yet at the same time I was one of the top students in that class. And and I so my mom was just very supportive of me in everything that I did, and
yeah.
even if that included not doing the things she wanted me to do.
Wow, that is a really cool mom. It sounds like that's awesome. I bet my kids would love for me to do that more often. But like I said, everything comes at a cost. I'm really curious to know how you got into psychedelics. How did you stumble upon it? Was it something that you were interested in, your friends had experiences with, or tell us that story of how you first got into psychedelics and how that happened?
Well, like many good things in life, I happened upon it by accident.
Okay.
My first experience was when I was studying abroad in Amsterdam.
Mm.
And, I was Mr. Goody Two Shoes in college. I wanted to be a politician.
Oh
And
wow.
so the first time I, smoked cannabis in university, I was like, yep, there goes my political career because I definitely inhaled. Then in Amsterdam, it was legal there to take mushrooms, but I had no idea what
Yeah.
this thing was. And suffice you to say, that experience I took way more than even this to this day I've ever taken into my life,
Wow.
um,
Wow.
and and had such a profound experience, but simultaneously like traumatizing experience
Mm.
that I didn't touch psychedelics for almost I don't know for a few years after that, 5 6 years after that. Um, what's interesting is that I use psychedelics recreationally in festivals, at Burning Man, and friends in nature for many years afterwards. And by the time I um, I went to my first ayahuasca retreat, I had already had over 100 psychedelic experiences. In fact, more
Wow.
experiences than the facilitators at that retreat had,
Wow.
but they were all recreational.
Got it.
And so,
And would
I
just describe
yeah.
that for people listening. Like, what does that mean, recreation? Like, you were doing it more of as a drug to escape, or what was your like? What do you mean, if you don't mind, for people listening?
Yeah, I it's interesting that you use the word drug because I think there's a difference between the word drug, the word medicine, and the word
Yes.
sacrament, right? Which are
Yes.
three different ways that you can term
That's
these
beautiful.
psychedelic substances.
Yep.
And I was using it as a drug.
Hmm.
I was using it for fun,
Yep.
and absolutely the use of psychedelics and entheogens changed my life. I Before I did it in an intentional setting, and I found greater beingness, authenticity, experience of oneness, experience of spirituality. I've experienced all those things before, um, but I didn't know what I didn't know. I
Yes.
didn't know what I was missing until I used, in that case, ayahuasca in a ceremonial context. Now, for those of your listeners that don't know what ceremony is we host ceremony a few times a month here in our center in Colorado. It's mats that are on the ground, like beds that are on the ground. Um, Ceremony is usually held at night in darkness,
Hmm.
and people imbibe, in our case, the sacrament, which is psilocybin mushrooms or ayahuasca, and then they go into a deep inner space. There's no talking or touching amongst participants. Some people wear blindfolds,
Hmm.
and as facilitators, we are playing music. Usually, that can be some combination of digital music or like live music. We're about 70-30
Wow.
live music
Cool.
and digital.
Yeah.
And the music can range from, in our case, classical minimalism, think Hans Zimmer
Yeah.
or Max Richter,
Yep.
to medicine music, which are music from indigenous tribes, really beautiful music in Spanish, Hebrew, Chinese, many different representations of culture. And what happens is when we're allowed space to go into an inwards place instead of being outwards, in connection with people, with distraction, etc., that gives space for our minds to fully embrace the psychedelic experience.
Yeah.
And we can go into that in a moment, but like the difference between recreational and
Yeah.
ceremonial, aka the difference between doing it as a drug or doing it as a medicine slash sacrament, is extraordinary.
And I love that you bring that up. And I've never really heard the difference of those three. I've heard of using it as a drug and using it as a medicine. And I do think it comes down to intention. And I think it's beautiful you describe it that way, because I think almost anything can be a drug. Like, I think as humans, we try and escape the pains of life through all kinds of drugs, whether it's recreational drugs, sex, porn, movies, food, alcohol, right? I think there's a lot of ways to escape or numb the pains of life. And that's why I think anything can be used as a drug,
Totally.
depending on your intention, right? And so I think that's a beautiful way of describing it. And I'm really excited to dive into that with you. But for people listening, I'm curious to know, what was the switch for you to go from using it recreationally, having fun with it, which I think there's a time and place for that, and there's things to learn from that too. But I also think that there's a lot of benefits that people don't know of using it, either as medicine or as a sacrament. What shifted for you to go from using it as a drug to using it more as a sacrament or a medicine?
So, going into my first ceremonial experience, I went in with a chip on my shoulder. I was like,
Okay.
I've done psychedelics 100 times. What could this possibly teach me, right?
Sure.
And I remember it was in Playa del Carmen, Mexico, and I remember pulling out the prep materials in Google Docs just before going to the retreat, and it's like, take this seriously, this life changing experience seriously. Eat this diet, don't drink coffee, don't drink alcohol. And I just closed my laptop. I was like, that's stupid. And I took a sip of my margarita, you know?
Yeah.
So when I went into the retreat, I thought I knew it all.
Hmm.
In my very first ceremonial experience, I'll never forget it because the first thing that happened was I experienced an embodied vision. Like it's kind of like a dream where you are living the experience, right? When you're in a dream, you don't know it's a dream. You
Yep.
are living that dream, right? You're tasting the food, you are touching the textures, you are feeling the feelings in a dream. Very similar. Okay.
Mm,
So in my vision, I was a baby being embraced by my mother
mm,
and drinking from the milk of her breast. And I was remember feeling this extraordinary amount of safety and love,
mm,
beyond that I remembered ever feeling. For sure, I felt that before as a baby, but the feeling of complete unencumbrance, complete relaxation, complete just the complete exhale of
mm,
everything's okay. That feeling alone, if I could go home right after that feeling, I would have been fully like it would have been life changing alone, right?
yeah,
Because that's why people go on vacation, for example. They
yeah,
they are seeking that feeling of complete relaxation, safety, right?
yeah.
The second experience I had in that very same session, very same ceremony, was a vision of my father who had passed 4 years prior,
Okay,
and
yeah.
I got to introduce my wife to my father, and I was crying because I felt such an elation in my body that there was this joyfulness that I didn't even know I was missing that in my life, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Like we in psychology we talk about, the steps of grief, but do they ever tell you about grieving the future life experiences that you'll never be able to share with that person, you
Mm,
know?
wow.
And I didn't even know I was missing that. I thought I had grieved my father.
Yeah.
And when I came out of that experience, I said, hallelujah, my life is changed. I can go home now. I am awakened. And yet, in that retreat, we had two more ayahuasca experiences.
Yeah.
um, my second experience, I went in with a self inquiry of my memory because I always had really terrible memory. And we get this a lot from participants. Like, I could barely remember my childhood,
Yeah.
fragments.
Hmm.
And even a few months back was really hazy, right?
Mm,
Um, and so when I took the medicine that night, I started reliving my memories in extraordinarily vivid detail.
yeah.
I remember um, the flights that I got on and feeling the seat. I remember turning my locker combination in school. I remember the texture of books that I was holding. Like
Mm,
I could see the blades of grass, and I was going back and back and back in time until I was in complete darkness, a baby child under sheets,
mm.
and then I felt horny. And I'm like, I popped up on my yoga mat in the jungle, and I'm like, how is this possible? And then when I went back in, I realized that I was sexually touched at 4 years
Mm.
old. That by a man that I would later recognize was my mother's boyfriend at the time.
Oh.
And in that moment, I said, "Oh my God!" Everything clicked into place. I started going forward in time and seeing the reverberations of not just the confusion, the pleasure, the guilt, the shame, but also the repression of all my memory.
Yeah.
I couldn't hold relationships. I had sexual confusion as a teenager. Um, there was something that occurred to me that I literally could not remember the extraordinary love that I shared with my mom,
Mm.
and all the way to the present moment that I was in the jungle with 49 other founders. I popped up. One of them is running around butt ass naked, screaming. I mean, it was wild, and
Yeah.
I laughed, and I'm like, I I feel like I was cured of Alzheimer's,
Yeah.
and that moment, as I shared earlier, heralded the renaissance of my life. Uh, so why am I doing what I'm doing, and where did psychedelics began? It began with an extraordinarily life changing experience where I could not deny um, the gift of these sacraments. The um, often it's called 10 years of therapy in 10 hours. I
Yeah.
don't believe I could have realized that in ten
Yeah.
years of therapy. I don't think I could have. You know,
Yeah.
so it's and I'll tell you, like, I've now worked with more than 500 individuals, more than
Yeah.
200, around 200 through Ceremonia, and my story is not uncommon. literally every retreat, we um, near 100% of the people have a transformative experience, as transformative as mine. So
Okay, first of all, Austin, I just want to say thank you for sharing that story with me and with all of us, and for being so vulnerable. It's so interesting because I remember listening to a podcast with Tim Ferriss, who almost told a very similar experience where he had forgotten about him being sexually assaulted as a toddler, and it all came very clear to him in a medicine journey, very similar to yours, and all the emotions of, like, shame and guilt and anger and frustration and all the things, and that's where the healing started to happen finally, when he remembered this experience that had happened, and he remembered it so vividly, just like you described. It's so interesting and so powerful. And this is why I do think that, psychedelics is a very powerful healing modality for people with unresolved trauma, because whether you think, like, the fact that your body had forgotten about it, it was like a survival mechanism almost, probably, for you to, like, hey, it's better for us, as like the brain, the heart, the body, the soul, it's all connected, to forget about this thing, so that maybe you could go throughout life. But until that's healed, it's stored in your body, right? Like the whole book, the whole concept of the body keeps the score. So I'm really curious and interested in that experience, and how, what happened after that. Like, what, where did it lead you? Did it finally lead to some healing and letting go of that? Did you, like, what happened after that? Did Were you able to finally feel the release of the heaviness of that experience? Or talk about the healing aspect of, once you became aware of it, where that led you.
it's so interesting, this word healing, because when I went into that, I didn't think I had anything to heal. Right.
Mm.
Um, for context, at that time, I had a very successful business. I was working, thanks to Tim Ferriss, 4 hours a week, traveling the world, making 30 to 50K a month, like a dream life,
Yeah.
And um, and after that experience, I realized, my God, I am a child. I um, have not lived my life, because I
Yeah.
haven't lived my life in the present moment. I was always chasing after something, whether that be chasing after an experience, chasing after a relationship, chasing after money. I was chasing. And I was also running away. I was running away from my feelings. I was running
Yeah.
away from my purpose. I was running away from commitment, And and all of that to say is, I didn't think I needed healing after that.
Mm.
It was very clear for me what healing felt like.
Yeah.
Um, I was able, within a week time, I had written letters and repaired my relationships with my mom, with with an ex girlfriend who I was with for 4 years, who's now one of my closest friends, and getting married at this upcoming Burning Man. I, um, with dear friends, I, you know, I I repaired so much externally.
Yeah.
But what we share here at Ceremonia is that this is just a portal. It's a gateway,
Mm.
right? It's a door opening, and you have to walk through that door. When I started walking through that door, so what's interesting is, um, my wife and I were in China when COVID hit China in December 2019.
Oh,
Okay,
wow.
and her family's from Wuhan.
Wow, really?
So yeah, and we got flights out of China. So when we arrived in the States in December, we were visiting her family for a vacation. We're like, okay, this is this is a big deal, right? It was at the ayahuasca retreat in February that the stock market crashed, and I was like, oh,
Yep.
it's coming here. And I remember in March, I was snowboarding in Utah with my wife, and Vail shut down all mountains nationwide. I don't know if you remember that. I think it was
Mm.
March 16th or something like that.
Yep.
And so we, I called my mom. I'm like, she's immunocompromised. I'm like, come to Vegas where we were staying. Um, we're gonna leave the country, right? And we decided to get the last flight into Costa Rica. Now, I'll return to my mom in a moment, but we went to Costa Rica, and I went there thinking I was just going to be there a month, and I was going to get my scuba dive master's license. Well, as soon as I landed, Costa Rica issued an edict that closed all the beaches. So I was like,
Mm.
okay, what are we going to do now?
Yeah.
Um, and that's when we decided to pursue this path of ayahuasca. And we were using ayahuasca and another medicine, LSD, in a ceremonial slash intentional like context frequently. I would not recommend this for people, by the way. We did it
Yeah.
too
Yeah.
frequently, and during that time, you know, we were living our best life. I think we won the pandemic lottery. But the
Wow.
untold story that I usually don't tell people is that the night before we left, I had an argument with my wife, and I told my mom, "I'm sorry, but you can't come with us."
Mm.
And it was extremely heartbreaking for
Wow.
me.
Yeah.
Um, so here I was in Costa Rica, like living a dream. There were no tourists there, right?
Yeah.
And we were living in Airbnbs that would normally cost 500 a night for 1,500 a month. You know,
Wow.
going to the main tourist waterfalls, like with nobody there. And meanwhile, I'm FaceTiming my mom back at home, and she's holed up in a room,
Oh,
scared
yeah.
because COVID, right? I mean, everybody probably remembers the height of COVID.
Yeah.
No one, they thought if you touched people, you would die. And so earlier we were talking about how I got my mom to come to a retreat, and this is still on the topic of healing because
Yeah.
when I came back 6 months later, I spent a month living with my mother,
Okay.
and every day spent an hour or two just talking with her, sharing with her, and sharing her in a very embodied sense my guilt, sadness, my grief, and my love for her, and that really helped repair the relationship to an
Mm.
extent. That was in October. My mother agreed to try plant medicine out in December. And
Wow.
at that time, I wasn't a facilitator like I am
Yeah.
now. And so we had a session together, and it was so transformative for her that she got off antidepressants that she was on for 20 years, literally since
Wow.
that car accident,
Wow.
right?
Okay.
More than 20 years. Um, which I feel incredible amounts of gratitude for. She used to wake up and just stare into emptiness for hours. That's how bad her depression was.
Wow.
Um, and then, you know, fast forward, my mother comes to a retreat last year,
Hmm.
and in that retreat, which we could go into later, she did a biopsy of tumors that were on her liver a month later, and they had all disappeared. And the doctor
Wow.
had no idea how that could be.
Hmm.
And again, this story that I'm relating to you at first glance might be shocking, but this is something I see all the time. Literally every retreat, there is some extraordinary level of physical healing. So, um, healing and psychedelics is there is such a strong mind body relationship, and I would argue a mind body spirit relationship,
Yeah.
right? That when we find healing at a psycho spiritual level, it manifests at a physical level too.
Mm.
So we've had people come in here with like severe allergies. We have a dog here, right?
Hmm.
Named Tofu, a very cute dog. And we had someone come in with severe dog allergies and said, "Oh, I don't know if I could be here." But after a single night's experience, not only did he not have any allergies, he also healed. This was literally last weekend. Healed a um, an ailment that he could not uncurl his toes. Um,
Mm.
he's a combat veteran, and I guess I don't know the exact story, but for more than 20 years, he could not uncurl his toes without physically
Wow.
prying it open. I
Mm.
was seeing specialists, was about to do surgery, etc. And after that first ceremony, he was like wiggling his toes at me. He was like, "Austin, look," and I was like, "Oh, cool. What's that?" He's like,
Yeah.
"I haven't been able to do this in more than 20 years." So
I appreciate
healing.
you sharing that with me because I went, people listening to my podcast have heard me talk about my experience in Costa Rica at an ayahuasca retreat down there. And it seems pretty common for people to come in with physical ailments of certain types and for miracles to happen. And I'm
Totally.
not a denier of that. I believe miracles do happen, and I think it's amazing. I love hearing that for your mom. I'm curious. The one question I have about your mom and doing psychedelics, her finally being open to trying it, did it change her faith at all? Did it strengthen her faith? I'm curious to know how, because you mentioned, her being a conservative Christian, people listening might be of a certain faith or a certain religion. I think that's a worry of like, oh, psychedelics will do this or do that to you. There's all these fears of the unknown. And I'm curious to know for your mom, how did it strengthen her faith? Did she lose her faith? Did it, like, curious to know about that, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So my mom's great passion in life is singing, and she was an opera singer as a kid and kind of
Wow.
lost that. And now she sings in choir all the time. I would say that, first I'd pose the question, like, how do we experience faith,
Hmm.
right? Because there's faith in terms of belief, and
Yep.
I believe things. I believe this glass I'm holding right now contains water, right?
Yeah.
But then there's the practice of faith, and the her coming out of depression and then leaning into her passions, which is so connected with her faith, praising Jesus in choir. Um, she fills her days now with that, and
Mm.
I I love sharing this because I experience her in so much joy. Sometimes she's like, I can't talk right now. She loves talking to me, by the way. Single son, single, right? And she's like, I can't talk right now. I'm busy. And she's just like singing in the background, you know?
Oh, got it.
So I would say the practice of her faith has increased so much. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, and in the final ceremony out of our three here in the retreat she was at, she sang a song in Chinese praising Jesus. And it was so incredibly beautiful.
Wow.
That's data point number one. But I'd
Okay.
like to share two more data points if that's
Sure.
okay with you.
Please do.
The first is the president of Unity Church, which is a mega church on the East Coast, came to our retreat. Really lovely
Mm.
man. And I recorded a podcast with him as well. His name is Matt. And he came and he had a picture of Jesus Christ on his altar. His altar is like next to his mat,
Yeah.
little trinkets that remind him of memories. And what he experienced, he said that he had never experienced such intimacy and depth with Christ consciousness, and
Hmm.
in many respects had forgotten the feeling of that, and it reinvigorated his faith. Um, the second data point is one of our participants turned co-facilitator was a Catholic priest for 25 years, and then became a Zen Buddhist monk, and then now one of the world's top psychologists. Reinvented
Wow.
PTSD treatment for the U.S. Army in the 90s. And he came and rediscovered his faith. He said that he had lost his faith before because he was running UN refugee programs in Africa, in East Africa, which, man, for the Catholic Church, right? Which is, come on, that's maybe as traumatic as it can get when it's
Yeah.
connected with religion, right? And and he said, like, coming back here and supporting in the space, he saw just how much we were healing with nature and in community, and that's what church really
Yeah.
should be about, community, right?
Yeah.
So the people that come in with their own flavor of faith um, usually walk out with a significantly enhanced
Yeah.
um, embodied feeling of faith, uh, and we get more Christians than non-Christians,
Mm.
and not a single one of them has lost faith.
Yeah. I appreciate you bringing that up, and it reminds me of. So I grew up in the Mormon religion that a lot of people might have heard of or are somewhat familiar with. But I listened to a
Mhm.
podcast with a buddy who talked about, one of these Mormon leaders, like a bishop or stake president, like a preacher of some type, in like that you would hear about in other religions. He had an experience doing ayahuasca, and he talked about it. And then, yeah, it's one of those things where it strengthens. It tends to strengthen the faith that one comes into it with, and I want people to hear that, because I know people think, oh, if I mix this, you know, plant medicine, which is not very common in the Christian world, right? We tend to stay away with, like, drugs are bad. All drugs are in the same category, right? And but here I know you and other people are saying, no, this is not a drug. It can be used as medicine and sacrament, and that whole Christ consciousness, that idea of, like, tapping into that through the plant medicine is a very powerful modality. And maybe it's not for everyone, but
Totally.
still being open to different modalities like this that lead to more profound, healing for some people, to let go of some things from the past, because maybe the tools that are given to them within the religion aren't enough for some people, like prayer and scripture and fasting, and those things are great modalities, and those can be healing for some people. But I do think there's other modalities that are available, like plant medicine, for example, that have been super profound for me, but for a lot of other people. And so, one of the questions I have for you is for people listening, because there's people of all, different chapters of life and different, faiths or belief systems, if you will, coming listening to this podcast. What are some things you want people to know before even getting started with psychedelics, whether they want to use it recreationally or they want to get into it as a medicine or a sacrament? What are some things that you now, as a practitioner, would like to pass on to those who are like scared or nervous or unsure? What would you want them to know about psychedelics in general so that they feel more comfortable or more safe if they do decide to do it one day? What should they know?
So I think the key word that you used is safe, right? And there are certain necessary things that I believe are important for safety. The first is legality.
Okay.
Um, so we're both state and federal level legal.
Okay.
Um, More than 12% of Americans use psychedelics uh, every year, but the 11.99% of those are using it illegally, right?
Mm,
So first I would say find a there are very limited options to find legal use of psilocybin or ayahuasca. Typically, those come in the form of entheogenic churches at a federal level.
okay.
But even those entheogenic churches, many of them are churches in sort of loophole name only and
Okay.
don't really offer you the protection they claim. A church is church when it's providing a service,
Okay.
right? So we have a Sunday service, and we have a community. Um, we we have texts, et cetera, et cetera. So I would first find something that is legal. Oregon has
Okay.
state level legal, and Colorado as well. Okay,
Okay.
and Colorado is very convenient because it's halfway in the middle of the country.
Yep.
So that's number one. Number two, this is an emergent field, and a lot of I like to say I know 100 plus facilitators. I trust six. There's
Yeah.
there's I saw you immediately smile and laugh because I'm like, I think you
It's,
get it.
I'm glad you talked about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and there are certain um, ways to evaluate a facilitator in a program. The first I would say is, do they have a bare minimum of preparation and integration support? Preparation is like before you go and have an experience, do they have an intake call? Is there medical review? Is there preparatory materials? We have people read a book, uh, ideally at least one of two books. The first is Letting Go by David Hawkins. And to your readers,
Mm,
I would highly recommend just picking up this book. It's a great,
yeah.
life changing book in itself. Letting Go by David Hawkins. And the second is No Bad Parts by Dr. Richard Schwartz, which
Mm,
is the consumer version of the most fastest growing psychotherapeutic and psychospiritual framework that is most often paired with psychedelic assisted therapy. Okay.
mhm.
So we have people read that. We have online coursework, AI assisted online coursework, Zoom calls, et cetera, for people to prepare. And I think that's really exceptionally important for people to feel safe. Okay. The second is integration. Integration is after the experience.
Yeah.
And I believe it's the most important part of this work because you can have a trip to the cosmos and high five God, but if you don't ground that into your 3D life and create a meaningful and positive impact on your relationships, on your business, on your presence, on your experience of yourself in life, then what's it all for? In
Yeah.
other words, if you go and experience this tremendous amount of love, then you come back to life and they're still an asshole, then it's not it's what it's not worth it.
Yeah.
And so having support and integration is exceptionally important. And the way that we do integration is we meet every Sunday for Sunday service where we practice um, a practice called circling, which is the default tool or default operating system of what we do together here in our retreats.
Mm,
And everything happens in community for us. So part of the work that we do here is people learn to ask for support. And we have this, imagine 200 people from all walks of life.
yeah.
There's top CEOs in the world and teachers. There's, doctors, and there's combat, like supporting each other. It's what I think
Yeah.
church is meant to be, right?
Yeah.
So the second point is have proper preparation and integration. And then
Okay.
the third is, I think of safety at three levels: mental, physical, and spiritual. Mental, have some trauma informed training;
Yeah.
physical, medical reviews, right? Protocols for physical emergencies. But spiritual is something that is often overlooked. And spiritual safety means when your mind is so open, do the facilitators give you the space to discover spirituality for yourself? Or are
Nice.
they impressing upon you their own dogma,
That's what I
right?
was gonna ask. Yeah. Mhm.
And so I would say for your listeners, if you are going and exploring facilitators or different programs, one really valuable way to test spiritual safety is to challenge the facilitator's beliefs.
Mm.
So, like, hey, what do you, hey, John Smith, what do you believe spiritually? What do you think is happening here? And they tell you, and they're like, how do you know that to be true? And just like challenge that, you know?
Mm.
And if that facilitator is getting triggered or avoiding the question or something, it's probably not someone you
Yeah.
want to go with.
Yeah.
Yeah. Was that
Yeah,
helpful?
it is very helpful. And I think for a lot of people listening, I think it's important. And I like how you broke it down between mental, physical, spiritual safety. Like that's huge when it comes to doing psychedelic work. In my opinion, is the ability to make someone feel safe, and also know that you're not going to be indoctrinated with someone else's dogma. And that's kind of what I've come to realize, having left my religion before I even got into psychedelics. I'm very careful of not of seeing things as a religion. And I come from the health and fitness world, so I see even like dietary protocols, like this type of diet is the way and I need to convert people to this, or like different camps in the fitness industry of like we have the truth, everyone else is being deceived.
Totally.
And so anything can get turned into religion and become dogmatic, including psychedelics, where this is just like a new religion of like this is the way and this is what saved me, so I need to convert people over to this belief system. And I think the difference that I've learned over years is the difference between like a cult and like a good religion is a cult, you can't question the leader, you can't question you know the
Yeah,
beliefs, because if you
exactly.
yeah, so I think that's a really, just you saying that, it just shows your humbleness, and just question their beliefs, and you're allowed to question instead of like, no, I'm the guru, you're the student, you listen to what I say, and I have the truth and you don't. So I think I love that you said that. The last thing I want to talk about really quick before we close is, earlier in the podcast you mentioned an experience you had that almost kept you from doing psychedelics for ever again. And I want you to talk about that, because I'm sure your perspective about that experience now has changed. Basically a quote unquote bad trip, and a lot of people might say, oh, I did this and I had a bad trip and psychedelics are not for me. Maybe dive into that, because maybe people have had bad experiences or have heard of people having bad experiences, and then they place meaning on it as if this is a bad thing. So maybe talk about how maybe your evolution and understanding of that bad trip, if you will, has evolved over the years, and maybe why you see it differently now.
Totally. And we get a lot of people that have had like adverse psychedelic experiences,
Yeah.
including adverse ceremonial or therapeutic experiences too.
Yeah.
Bad trips happen when the what we are experiencing is over the capacity for us to hold the experience. Okay.
Mm.
And it mirrors life. When I'm in a fight with my wife, and my and let's say I didn't sleep well or I got a lot going on and my capacity is low, then I might say fuck, or I
Yeah.
might like run away, or I might freeze,
Yeah.
the fight, flight, or freeze mechanism, right? So everyone's had that experience in life. That is amplified in the psychedelic experience, right? So here's another really important aspect of safety, and it's fundamentally what our value system around Ceremonia is we believe in supporting people to learn the skills to and then practicing those skills to build their capacity so they can hold more experience.
Mm.
And the skills begin with mindfulness, right? Like you can only consciously change what you're aware of. So first, how do we develop our awareness of what we're experiencing now? And um, the second part of mindfulness is attention. How do we hold attention on a challenging experience? For
Yeah.
example, our final workshops before ceremony is a cold plunge. Do you do cold plunges, Drew?
Mm. Yeah, I do actually. I'm a big fan. That's cool.
Do
You
you
have
remember
that
the
as part
very
of your.
first time that you did it though? And now like you're like, "Oh, damn, do I really want?"
Yeah, yeah, I do.
Yeah.
I do remember, and it's yeah, it's pretty rough your first time, but I
Yeah.
do remember that experience.
Even the very nature of the expectation of it creates the fight, flight, or freeze mechanism for people.
Mm.
But we have people go in the cold plunge in pairs. So they're eye gazing while they're going in, and they're doing a
Oh, cool.
practice that they did in a workshop a few hours earlier called Here, where they're eye gazing and they can say one of four things: I'm here, you're here, I left, you left. In
Mm.
other words, are we here together in this present moment, meeting this experience with our attention, right?
Yeah.
So that's mindfulness. The second is connection. Like connection is when we feel a family, like a community, that we're able to support each other in in challenges and celebrations. And we do a lot of practices that are informed by psychotherapy in building authentic connections, right?
Mm.
And the third is self-empowerment, which is which I believe is the number one ingredient for safety. If you felt powerful to meet any experience, well, you probably feel like the safest person on earth because any challenge can come your way, right? And you will be able to meet that with your own curiosity, compassion, courage, right? So when people don't have the skills, when they don't have the capacity, and then they go into a psychedelic experience, often with anxiety or fear, it's very easy to trigger that fight, flight, or freeze mechanism. And when that mechanism is triggered, it can lead to a bad trip because we begin resisting the experience.
Yeah.
Same thing can happen in a cold plunge. If you resist the experience, you can leave it, or you can dissociate, right?
Yeah.
Which is the freeze, or you could grip and try to force your way through it. But you can't leave a psychedelic experience
Yeah.
because once you take the medicine, the sacrament, you're along for the ride, right?
Yep.
And so by training for being able to hold more, we I can't say prevent, but we
Sure.
support people in um, in significantly diminishing the likelihood of an adverse experience
Yeah.
and significantly enhancing the likelihood of not just an impactful experience, but the efficacy of the experience.
Yeah.
And I would say that out of roughly 200 participants, we've only had two people um, ever leave.
Yeah.
Um, and this is, facilitating people that are combat vets and complex PTSD and so on and so forth. So
Yeah.
again, for your listeners, if you're afraid of a bad trip, it's the same thing. Like if you're going to go into life-changing surgery, right? Would you ask your friend to do it? Probably not.
Yeah.
Would
Yeah.
you do it on yourself? Definitely not. What would you do? You would do your homework and choose the very best experts, right?
Yeah.
And you would probably prepare yourself. I can't imagine you would go to McDonald's and have a beer beforehand. You would probably like, you know, eat more healthy, do an inventory of your life,
Yeah.
like tell your family I love you. Like you would do some psycho emotional stuff, right? Same thing with psychedelics. This has the potential to change your life.
Yeah.
So if you're going into a life-changing experience, please like do yourself a favor and give it your care.
Yeah. I appreciate you talking about that. The things I've learned about, uncomfortable or hard trips for people, for me personally, is like, first of all, just the whole concept of letting go and surrendering to what is and realizing that it's all there to serve a purpose. Kind of like Rumi, the quote, the cure for pain is in the pain. So turn towards the pain. Don't run away from it. Don't let it consume you. Just realize that pain is a teacher as well. And so hard experiences like in life, it sucks to go through them, whether you're having a psychedelic experience or just a hard life experience. Those kinds of things can happen, but they're there to serve you. I think looking at it from that perspective is helpful, but also realizing that doing, and this is why I'm such a proponent of doing your research, finding a place like Ceremonia or something where you feel safe, where you're like, hey, these people are going to be there to support me through it. I'm not alone in this. I'm not going to be stuck like this. And there's a good, you know, experienced team to help me through this if it does happen. But I think you guys probably do a great job of preparing people and educating them before, during, and after, which I think is so important. So just closing up here, Austin, I want people, I want to give you a chance to let people know where people can find you personally, but also Ceremony, and learn more about these experiences that you guide people through. So where can people go to find out more and possibly go to Colorado and experience this in person? Which honestly, I'm feeling like that might be something in my near future. So I will keep you posted on that. But
Well, would love to have you.
yeah, I think this is a great opportunity for a lot of people. So, yeah, where can people learn more?
Well, we're a legal and nonprofit psychedelic spiritual center halfway between Denver and Boulder in Colorado. So just 40 minutes from the airport, from Denver International Airport. And we facilitate 2 retreats a month.
Okay.
So we have a lot of availability with psilocybin mushrooms, and about once every half year, our level 2 program with ayahuasca.
Okay.
People can find us online at ceremoniacircle.org. Ceremonia, like in Espanol, Ceremonia Circle. Also on Instagram, Ceremonia Circle, and on YouTube as well. We have our own podcast called Modern Enlightenment,
Mm,
and interview a lot of really exceptional people. Rick Doblin's going to be on it shortly. Just interviewed
nice.
Zach Leary, the son of Timothy Leary, and lots of really special
Wow.
people. So, yeah. And, if you have trouble finding us, you can just Google like psilocybin or retreat Colorado or ayahuasca retreat Colorado. I think we're the number one hit.
Yeah.
Um, would be so excited to serve your listeners. I just imagine that many of them are on the path of their own kind of physical betterment,
Yeah.
and you know this is really beautiful and deep work that can be supportive of that.
Yeah, and this is the last thing I'll say before we end. Thank you, and we'll put all that in the show notes for people. The reason I want to have people like you on, or you specifically, Austin, when I got your email from your team to have you on, is because there's a quote that I love, and I actually don't know who said this, but it resonates with me and my audience and my own personal journey. But it goes, if you don't heal what hurt you, you're gonna bleed on those who didn't cut you. And so I think for me, life is about becoming aware of your pain and your hurt and where it stems from and why and how it affects you, and learning to go through the process of doing the work, whether it's through psychedelics or therapy or whatever works for you, to do the work, so you don't continue that bleeding, that hurt that gets passed on to the next generation. And I think that's kind of how we can serve our kids and our grandkids, the future generations, to break the cycles of, like you mentioned, generational trauma. And it's one of those things where you need to become aware of it first, and when you become aware of it, then you can start to, you know start the healing process. But if it's continually suppressed and denied and pretending like it doesn't exist, it just leads to more and more hurt and pain, and it manifests sometimes in physical forms, and sometimes we take it out on people who are innocent. And so that's why I want to have these things on, because or sorry, people like you on, to provide tools and modalities in this modern world where we do have options now, and you don't have to stay stuck where you are and be like, well, this is just the way life is. Like there's a lot of opportunities, and the fact that we have something like this in the United States that is legal, and you could just go to Colorado and Google your your services. I think it's a privilege, the time that we live in. So, Austin, I just want to say thank you for what you do. Thank you for coming on, and I'm super grateful, like, for you stumbling upon, you know, these medicines. And I know you've helped heal so many people. So continue doing what you're doing, man, and thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Drew. It's been
Yeah,
a
my
pleasure.
pleasure. Okay.